Appreciate. I still don't know a single fucking person who understands what 9/11 symbolically represents. One of the superficial aspects behind why that was carried out has to do with, quite literally, locking down the realm, because the goal is control, tightening the noose, and all the other things I rattle off often. In other words, doing away with civil liberties, which is why the Patriot Act was rolled out. If you look at the year here, 2 years after that took place. Curious, don't you think? There's a pattern of behavior. These are all red flags. Also, don't get ahead of yourself, and do appreciate this. And most people don't know about this because I'm surrounded by superficial internet babies who are fucking retarded, which is why things are bad and why they're getting worse. The Obama administration renewed and extended the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was going to expire. Not really. I mean, it was slated to, but it wasn't actually going to happen because the Obama administration was always going to renew and extend it, which means they were going to reassure that even more civil liberties were done away with. Flash forward, and the year is technically 2025. It's not 2026 yet because March 21st hasn't rolled around. Once again, I'm surrounded by fucking retards. I realize most of you would probably say, what does this mean? Because you are a fucking retard. This is when ICE was established. As I like to remind people, ICE would not exist if you and I were surrounded by smart people willing to do the right thing. It would not exist. We would not be suffering through what we are currently experiencing. People wouldn't be disappearing. All this garbage would not take place. I also like to remind people, if you're one of these morons who talks about illegal this and illegal that, there's no such thing. There is no such thing. But you bought into a phony jurisdiction you were spoon-fed because you're a gullible fucking retard. If you think that you're legal and other people are illegal, you're a fucking fool. You are a fool. You either have freedom or you have all these phony jurisdictions which do away with freedom, which is also why I mentioned the Patriot Act. Those are new phony jurisdictions, or at least they were at the time. All these things do is chip away at anything remotely close to being free. I rattle this shit off all the goddamn time because most people haven't figured any of it out. The Republic fell during the Civil War. It was finalized in 1871 when the Organic Act established the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia is a phony third-party jurisdiction. It's quite literally the secret, shadow government, which isn't secret at all. And it's only part of it. It's the bottom. And you don't hear people focused on this because you don't shop these things around. Most people don't. Most people don't know these things. And when you tell them about it and they Google it and Google doesn't tell you this is what's what, you assume otherwise. Because you're a retarded, superficial internet baby who is incapable of thinking critically and connecting dots on your own. Which goes back to, what does this mean? You need to tell me. So I can accept it and or repost it. Because you're not willing to take any of the key words and work with it. Because you're a retarded, superficial internet baby. Once again, that's why things are bad and why they're getting worse. This phony jurisdiction that I'm talking about having to do with the third party, government, for lack of better words, the District of Columbia, it's a slice of the pie. I like to remind people that in 1913, that's when citizens were converted into debt slaves, because the currency, this is when it began, essentially, was being converted into exclusively debt, which is why there's no longer any gold in Fort Knox. And retarded, superficial internet babies will say, yes, there is. Currency is not backed by a gold standard, you stupid fucks. You and I are the value. That's why our straw man and the social security number, which is absolutely unconstitutional. You shouldn't have a number associated with your name. And your name in general has been turned into a corporation. That's why this shit's traded on the stock exchange. Because there's no gold in Fort Knox, motherfucker.
I promised myself I wouldn't make this kind of video anymore, but honestly, some things are just too big to ignore. Now, I realise that I'm going to get a lot of comments from people who think that I'm a woke leftist. But German history is one of the things that I talk about on this channel, and when parallels are already being drawn between major events today and what was happening in Germany about 95 years ago, it would be remiss of me not to say anything. So as US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, continues to terrorize the general population, many of its critics have been comparing it to the infamous Gestapo, suggesting that it's part of a new fascist regime being set up even as we speak. I don't think that this is the best comparison, though. That's not to say that the events unfolding over there are not horrifying, they absolutely are, but I personally would compare ICE not with the Gestapo, but with the SA. The Gestapo is a rather different organisation. So perhaps we should start by asking ourselves the question, what was the Gestapo exactly? Now, if, like me, you're British and grew up in the 1980s watching the sitcom Allo Allo, you might remember Herr Flick of the Gestapo. Or if you're not that old, you might be thinking of Stephen Merchant's character in the movie Jojo Rabbit. But of course, these satirical portrayals really don't do justice to the sheer horror of what the Gestapo actually got up to. The word Gestapo is actually a contraction of the phrase Geheime Staatspolizei, which means secret state police. It wasn't secret in the sense that nobody knew it existed, it was secret in the sense that it was responsible for covert surveillance and intelligence gathering. At least that was the intention when it was set up in 1933, although set up is not exactly the right word here. It was formed out of the Prussian secret political police, which had been around since the 1850s. Its job was to monitor political activities and investigate political crimes. It had become necessary, in the eyes of the government, after a revolution in 1848 almost succeeded in putting an end to the absolute monarchy and turning Germany into a parliamentary democracy. The political police was supposed to ensure that that didn't happen again. It failed though, and the German monarchy finally came to an end in 1918, after which the political police had a new task. Now it was to protect democracy against extremists from both the left and the right, which, by the way, included the new National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Again, it failed, and in 1933 it was reformed into the new secret state police to guard, once again, against the evils of democracy. Except now, instead of defending the monarchy, it was defending the Nazis. This new organization quickly became little more than a branch of the government, and its job was to identify and neutralize any remaining political threats to the regime. Unfortunately, it was a little bit too honest, and the government didn't like Gestapo reports that suggested the general population wasn't completely happy with the regime. So in 1936, the surveillance part of its job was taken over by the Security Service, which passed on to the Gestapo any intelligence it gathered about political dissent. The Gestapo was then responsible for not only investigating these reports, but also for administering punishments, which could range from small fines all the way to summary execution, which it was empowered to do without the tedious rigmarole of having to get the courts involved. Not that that would have made much difference, because by then the government had already made sure that all of the judges were Nazis. The Gestapo were brutal and used all kinds of unethical practices to persecute anyone they regarded as an enemy of the state. For example, they would blackmail and torture their victims and even fabricate evidence simply in order to extract confessions from them. But what they didn't generally do was to march around the streets in broad daylight, beating, arresting, and even killing anyone for any reason. That, as I said, was the speciality of the SA. The history of the SA is even more complicated and confusing than that of the Gestapo, but basically it goes back to the very beginnings of what would eventually become the Nazi Party. This was in the uncertain and sometimes violent period between the two world wars, when it was quite normal in Germany for political parties to employ their own security personnel. The Nazis were no exception, and their security guys formed what came to be the Storm Division, the SA. These were not people who were selected for their intelligence. It was a paramilitary organization that specialized in brute force. As the Nazis grew in power and influence, the SA was doing a pretty good job of instigating fights and riots in the streets. Its main targets were communists, social democrats, Jews, and even some Christian groups. In short, they were thugs who, over time, became more and more organized and eventually developed a military-style hierarchy. In 1933, as the Nazi Party was tightening its grip on power, the SA was in effect used as a kind of auxiliary police. Regular police officers were made to patrol together with SA men who were authorized to act on behalf of the state. Once the infamous Reichstag decree was enacted, the SA was suddenly free to do almost anything it wanted, and set about terrorizing, arresting, imprisoning, and torturing anyone they didn't like. However, while the SA helped to put the Nazis in power, it was now in a position to remove the Nazis from power, and had therefore become a threat. So in 1934, the party neutralized the SA by assassinating its senior members and taking over its leadership. So, to sum up, the Gestapo was mostly concerned with investigating and punishing political dissent, while the SA was more concerned with terror through brute force. How does this correspond to present-day America? There are, of course, no perfect matches, because history doesn't really repeat itself. As the saying goes, it rhymes. So we're not looking for exact parallels, but rough approximations. My impression of ICE's activities at the moment is that they're closer to what the SA might have done. According to reports, its recent massive intake of new recruits has happened with very little oversight and barely any training at all, as evident in the astoundingly unprofessional conduct we've seen of late. So I think that ICE is being, or has been, reformed into the Trump administration's SA. Bullies who are authorized by the state to bully people. The role of Gestapo, I think, is more likely going to be played by something like the FBI, perhaps with the help of an intelligence agency like the CIA, just as the Gestapo was helped by the security service. And I have to be honest, given the apparent lack of oversight, I have a nasty suspicion that a lot of these new ICE agents were involved in the January 6th insurrection and have little or no formal training. In short, they are, not to put too fine a point on it, thugs. And I think this is what we have to bear in mind. It's not just one organization that we have to worry about. The Nazi regime was supported by a whole network of different organizations, each one protecting all of the others.
This is the account that posted this jazz, just so you know. And as always, you should be taking screenshots if I flash something like this and quickly move on. Use your brain. But more importantly, well, it's equally important, utilize the tools that are available to you. Superficial internet babies.